April 1945. The Bavarian air, still cold and heavy, hung thick with the stench of death. American troops, among them a young Jewish nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Weinberg, had just forced open the gates of Dachau, liberating a horror that defied description. Mountains of emaciated bodies, prisoners reduced to living skeletons, the acrid, sickening smell of decay mingling with the faint sweetness of still smoking crematoria. But amidst this unimaginable landscape, an order was issued, one that would force these liberators to confront a moral abyss. These same Jewish nurses, many whose families had perished in the very system they now faced, were to treat the wounded German soldiers, SS men among them, waiting in makeshift tents, and, incredibly, many had begged for the opportunity. In the final desperate collapse of the Third Reich, a choice emerged that would test the very boundaries of human compassion and professional duty. What profound, perhaps unfathomable drive compelled these women to offer aid to the architects of such unspeakable evil? Before we delve into this extraordinary chapter, tell us, where are you watching us from today? Let us know in the comments below. Now, let's journey back to where this impossible story began. April 1945. The air over Bavaria, thick and still, carried the biting chill of the retreating winter, an omnipresent cold that seeped into the very marrow of those who breathed it. Above, the sky hung like a vast, unyielding slab of slate, devoid of warmth or light, mirroring the grim reality unfolding beneath it. On this particularly desolate morning, the vanguard of the United States 45th Infantry Division, a unit that had borne the brunt of fierce combat across Italy and France, made their cautious approach to the compound marked on their map simply as Dachau. Their intelligence reports had offered clinical details, vague warnings of a labor camp, but the clinical detachedness of official documents proved utterly inadequate against the immediate visceral truth. At approximately 11:00 a.m. on April 29th, the leading elements of the Thunderbird Division, specifically the 157th Infantry Regiment, systematically breached the camp's main gates. What greeted them within the barbed wire perimeter was not merely a scene of devastation, but a calculated landscape of human annihilation, a testament to a cruelty so profound it defied any pre-existing framework of human experience. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unseen malevolence, heavy with a cloying, sickly sweet stench of decomposition that intertwined insidiously with the metallic tang of dried blood, and the faint, acrid residue of still smoldering crematoria. The large brick furnaces, dark and silent now, stood as mute, hulking monuments to an industrial-scale extermination, their chimneys pointing accusingly towards the indifferent sky. The ground within the camp was not merely littered, but systematically piled with bodies. These were not the bodies of soldiers fallen in battle, but the emaciated remains of civilians, stripped of their identities and their very humanity. They were stacked in macabre heaps, some reaching higher than a man's head, their limbs intertwined in a final involuntary embrace of death. Their forms, reduced to little more than skin stretched taut over skeletal frames, bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation and systematic brutality. Their eyes, wide and vacant, stared upwards, reflecting the leaden Bavarian sky, silent witnesses to their own unimaginable end. Among these silent witnesses moved the living dead, the survivors. They were spectral figures, their movements agonizingly slow and deliberate, as if each step was an act of immense conscious will. Their faces, gaunt and etched with years of unimaginable terror and deprivation, bore expressions of a profound, unutterable weariness that went beyond mere exhaustion. They were theoretically free, yet their spirits remained tethered to the abyss they had endured, their liberation a fragile concept against the pervasive backdrop of their physical and psychological decay. The shock among the battle-hardened American soldiers was immediate and profound. The disciplined facade of combat veterans cracked under the weight of such unadulterated horror. Some wept openly, others vomited, their weapons temporarily forgotten as they struggled to process the unfolding nightmare. Among the American medical personnel advancing into this inferno was Lieutenant Sarah Weinberg. At 28 years old, she served as a military nurse with the United States Army Nurse Corps, her resolve and professional composure honed by months of arduous service in field hospitals across the European theater. Her uniform, meticulously maintained, offered a stark contrast to the pervasive filth and squalor that surrounded her. Her personal history, however, imbued this horrific landscape with an additional, deeply personal resonance. Her parents, Jewish refugees, had fled their home in Poland in 1938, a departure that had, by a twist of fate, spared them the very fate now laid bare before her. As she navigated the debris-strewn pathways, her gaze moved methodically from the grotesque mounds of the dead to the hollowed yet glimmering eyes of the living. Professionalism was her shield, an ingrained instinct against the tidal wave of raw, unfiltered horror. Yet the sight of children, their faces ancient beyond their years, their bodies barely clinging to life, introduced a visceral shock that bypassed all training. This was not the chaotic brutality of the battlefield, with its sudden, often impersonal violence. This was a deliberate, systematic eradication of human dignity, a calculated dismantling of life itself. She found herself focusing on the specific tasks, assessing a collapsed survivor, offering a sip of water, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as her mind struggled to reconcile the scene with any known human reality. She maintained a rigid posture, her breathing shallow and controlled, a silent struggle to suppress the surge of personal grief and outrage in favor of immediate medical necessity. Simultaneously with the urgent humanitarian effort inside the camp, a separate and equally complex logistical challenge presented itself just beyond Dachau's immediate perimeter. In a series of hastily erected canvas field hospitals and requisitioned local structures, hundreds of German soldiers lay wounded. These were not merely the defeated remnants of an ordinary army. A significant number among them still wore the distinctive, often blood-stained, uniforms of the SS, the very organization responsible for the meticulous planning and brutal execution of the atrocities now being uncovered just a few hundred yards away. Their presence created an immediate, profound moral quandary for the American command. Under the terms of the Geneva Conventions, which the Allied forces meticulously upheld, all prisoners of war, regardless of their past actions or allegiances, were explicitly entitled to adequate medical care. Yet the available medical staff was already critically stretched, grappling not only with the overwhelming needs of the newly liberated prisoners, but also with the ongoing demands of treating Allied wounded. The sheer numbers of German prisoners requiring attention, many with severe injuries, compounded an already dire situation. It was in this crucible of unprecedented horror and ethical complexity, a landscape where the lines between victim and perpetrator were starkly drawn, yet disturbingly blurred by the demands of war, that an extraordinary directive was issued. The order, transmitted through the chain of command to various medical units, quickly reverberated throughout the American lines. It was a command that would challenge the very core of professional duty and personal conviction. The Jewish nurses, women like Lieutenant Weinberg, whose families had fled, or in some cases, had been utterly consumed by the very Nazi regime they now confronted, were to be specifically assigned to treat these wounded German soldiers, including the SS men among them. The directive initially met with a mixture of disbelief, quiet apprehension, and even outright protest among some American medical officers and non-Jewish personnel, soon revealed an even more astonishing detail. Many of these Jewish nurses had not merely accepted this deeply challenging assignment with stoic professionalism, they had, in fact, actively sought it out, pleading with their superiors, even begging, for the opportunity to care for the very men who had served a system dedicated to their systematic extermination. This revelation, quiet yet explosive, laid bare a moral dilemma of unfathomable depth. For the military command, it presented a conundrum. How could they reconcile the professional oath of these nurses with the profound, raw personal trauma and the widely held desire for justice? For the nurses themselves, it introduced a paradox that transcended the conventional boundaries of war, revenge, and medical ethics. The implications were immense. It was an act that defied simplistic interpretations of vengeance or forgiveness, setting the stage for a narrative that would probe the deepest questions of humanity in the face of absolute inhumanity. The decision was made. The orders were unambiguous. The Jewish nurses would enter those tents, their hands poised to heal, their hearts and minds poised to grapple with the unimaginable. The threshold of hell had been crossed, but the true moral journey had only just begun. February 1945. The German Third Reich, once a terrifying monolithic power, was now a collapsing empire, its borders relentlessly shrinking under the immense, synchronized pressure of the Allied offensive. From the west, American and British forces, having pushed through the fierce resistance of the Ardennes and crossed the Rhine, were driving deep into the German heartland. From the east, the Soviet Red Army, having smashed through the last desperate German defenses, was surging westward, their advance a relentless, unstoppable tide. The machinery of war that had sustained Nazi Germany for nearly 6 years was grinding to a halt, starved of resources, manpower, and the will to fight. Cities lay in ruins, their industrial capacity crippled by ceaseless aerial bombardment. The once vaunted Wehrmacht, a force renowned for its efficiency, was now a fractured, desperate entity, composed increasingly of conscripted old men and barely trained boys, thrown into the breach with obsolete equipment and dwindling supplies. As the Allied lines advanced, a new and unforeseen logistical crisis began to unfold. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, found himself grappling with a problem of unprecedented scale: the exponential surge in German prisoners of war. With each liberated town and each collapsing pocket of resistance, tens of thousands of enemy combatants, disoriented and demoralized, were surrendering en masse. By February, the numbers were staggering, swelling far beyond initial projections. Among these prisoners, a significant and growing proportion arrived at Allied lines wounded, some critically. These were soldiers mangled by artillery, riddled with shrapnel, suffering from frostbite, untreated infections, and the myriad injuries inflicted by a brutal losing war. Their immediate medical needs presented a monumental challenge, threatening to overwhelm the already strained Allied infrastructure. The Allied command, deeply committed to upholding the tenets of international law and humanitarian conduct, was bound by the explicit dictates of the 1929 Geneva Conventions relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. These conventions were unequivocal: wounded prisoners, regardless of their nationality or their role in the conflict, were entitled to humane treatment and proper medical care. To deny such care would not only be a moral failing, but also a strategic misstep, potentially inviting reciprocal brutality against Allied prisoners. However, adhering to this obligation proved incredibly difficult. The sheer volume of wounded German prisoners arriving daily, combined with the grim revelations emerging from newly liberated territories, the first harrowing glimpses of concentration camps, hinting at the true scale of Nazi atrocities, placed an almost unbearable burden on Allied medical resources. The critical scarcity of Allied medical personnel was not a new problem, but it was now reaching a breaking point. Hospitals, both fixed and field, were already operating at maximum capacity, tending to thousands of Allied wounded from the relentless fighting. Every surgeon, every nurse, every medic was invaluable, stretched thin across a vast and rapidly shifting front. The logistical nightmare of evacuating and treating Allied casualties alone was immense. To absorb the additional burden of tens of thousands of enemy wounded, many of whom required extensive long-term care, seemed an insurmountable task. There simply were not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough beds, and not enough supplies to meet every demand simultaneously. It was against this backdrop of logistical desperation and moral imperative that an unexpected, even shocking proposal began to circulate within the Allied Medical Corps. From within the ranks of the American and British Army Nurse Corps, specifically from among the Jewish women serving, came an offer that initially seemed not only counterintuitive, but potentially dangerous. These women, many of whom were refugees from Europe, whose families had been displaced, persecuted, or even murdered in the gas chambers of the Holocaust, began to volunteer, not merely to serve where needed, but to volunteer, specifically, for the assignment of treating wounded German soldiers. The initial reaction among military commanders and even some medical colleagues was one of incredulity. How could these women, many still bearing the fresh wounds of personal loss and trauma directly attributable to the very regime these soldiers served, maintain the objectivity and professionalism required? The idea seemed not only imprudent, but potentially reckless. There was apprehension about the emotional toll on the nurses, the potential for volatile confrontations with the German patients, and the sheer moral complexity of asking victims to minister to their tormentors. Yet, the proposal gained traction, fueled by both the dire practical necessity and the extraordinary resolve of these nurses themselves. At the heart of this seemingly paradoxical decision lay a profound philosophical conviction, articulated by individuals like Captain Ruth Goldstein. Born in Berlin in 1914, she had been evacuated with her family to New York in 1936, narrowly escaping the escalating persecution. By 1945, at 31 years old, she was a seasoned military nurse, her quiet demeanor belying an iron will. In her personal diary, a meticulously kept record of her wartime experiences, she penned words that would echo the sentiments of dozens of her colleagues. They tried to turn us into animals, to strip us of our humanity. If we refuse to treat them, we prove them right. If we treat them, we prove them wrong about everything. This was not a call for forgiveness, nor an act of naive compassion. Instead, it was an assertion of self, a reclamation of dignity through the unwavering commitment to the ethical principles of their profession. It was a strategic act of moral defiance, demonstrating through care and healing that the inhumanity of the enemy would not be allowed to corrupt their own fundamental values. This powerful, almost spiritual motivation resonated deeply with many Jewish nurses, transforming a seemingly impossible choice into a deeply personal imperative. The task of evaluating and ultimately authorizing this unprecedented initiative fell to Colonel David Marcus. A 42-year-old Jewish officer, Marcus was responsible for coordinating the medical treatment of German prisoners in the southern sector of Germany. He understood the immense logistical pressure on Eisenhower's command, but he also grasped the profound ethical and psychological implications of such a program. His initial skepticism was tempered by the undeniable practical need and the sheer conviction displayed by the volunteering nurses. After extensive consultation with medical ethicists, military psychologists, and his own command, Colonel Marcus cautiously authorized the experiment, as he privately termed it. However, this authorization came with a stringent set of protocols designed to mitigate the inherent risks. These rigorous guidelines were non-negotiable. First, the nurses would always work in pairs, ensuring mutual support and witness. This buddy system was intended not only to provide immediate assistance in medical procedures, but also to offer a psychological buffer against the emotional strain and potential for hostile interactions. Second, armed guards would be present at all times within the immediate vicinity of the hospital tents and wards where German prisoners were being treated. This measure was a practical security necessity, safeguarding the nurses against any physical threats, but it also served as a clear demarcation of authority and control. Third, and critically, a robust system of psychological monitoring and support was established. Any nurse exhibiting signs of severe psychological trauma, emotional distress, or an inability to maintain professional impartiality would be immediately transferred from the program without question or reprisal. Regular debriefing sessions with military psychiatrists were mandated, acknowledging the extraordinary emotional burden this work would entail. Colonel Marcus understood that he was sanctioning a deeply unconventional high-stakes endeavor. It was a calculated risk, weighing the desperate need for medical personnel against the profound potential for emotional and moral injury. But if successful, it promised not only to alleviate a critical logistical bottleneck, but also to stand as a powerful, documented testament to the enduring principles of humanity and ethical duty, even in the darkest shadows of genocide. The decision was made, the protocols were set, and the stage was prepared for a confrontation unlike any other in the annals of wartime medicine. Mid-April 1945. With Colonel David Marcus's authorization and stringent protocols in place, the experiment began. Across the liberated territories of southern Germany, in hastily erected field hospitals and requisitioned structures, the air hung heavy with the distinct odors of antiseptic, stale blood, and an underlying scent of fear. This was the new front line for the Jewish nurses, a battleground not of bullets and bombs, but of moral fortitude and professional obligation. Rows of cots filled with wounded German soldiers stretched across the wards. Armed guards, silent and watchful, maintained a constant presence, their rifles a stark reminder of the extraordinary nature of these interactions. The nurses, adhering to Marcus's directive, worked in pairs, a silent pact of mutual support and observation, forged in the crucible of an impossible assignment. Among the first nurses to enter these contested spaces was Lieutenant Miriam Rosenfeld. At 26, Miriam hailed from Chicago, a city that now seemed impossibly distant. Her parents, survivors of the Kishinev pogrom, had instilled in her a quiet, steely determination. Her initial assignment placed her in a cluster of tents near a recently secured crossroads, a vital artery for the flow of prisoners and casualties. Her task was clear: triage, stabilize, and treat. The patients, however, were anything but straightforward. Miriam's first week was a demanding blur of activity and profound moral challenge. In her official report, she would later note treating 47 wounded German soldiers. The diversity of their reactions was immediately striking, dismantling any preconceived notions of a monolithic enemy. There were young Wehrmacht soldiers, many barely out of their teens, conscripted in the war's desperate final months. Their faces, pale with shock and pain, often streamed with tears, their cries for their mothers echoing in the tense silence of the tents. Many suffered grievous injuries, shrapnel wounds, severe frostbite, limbs mangled by explosions. They were often disoriented, confused, and overwhelmed, their youthful faces etched with a fear that transcended ideology. Miriam found herself administering sedatives, not just for physical pain, but to quell their profound emotional distress as they faced the prospect of amputation or permanent disfigurement. Their sheer youth and raw vulnerability presented an immediate ethical challenge, demanding a level of professional compassion that seemed almost at odds with their uniform. In stark contrast were the hardened veterans, particularly those from the SS. Their demeanor was often one of defiant hostility, their faces grim, their eyes burning with an unrepentant ideological fervor. Miriam encountered men whose arms and chests bore the distinctive, often crudely tattooed, runic symbols of the SS, marks of a deep and violent allegiance. 3 such individuals, upon discovering that Miriam and her partner, Lieutenant Sarah Cohen, were Jewish, explicitly refused their care. Their weak voices laced with venom muttered epithets such as dirty Jewesses and inferior race. These rejections were not merely verbal. One attempted to physically swat Miriam's hand away, while another, a man with a shattered arm, spat deliberately onto the clean white bandage she was about to apply. In these instances, adherence to the Geneva Conventions necessitated forceful intervention. Guards were summoned, and the resisting patients were physically restrained and sedated, often under protest, to allow critical surgical procedures or wound dressings to proceed. The act of sedating a man so he could be saved, despite his virulent hatred, was an experience that Miriam noted as profoundly unsettling in her internal report, a direct clash between the oath to heal and the raw reality of hatred. Yet, among these extremes, Miriam also documented moments of bewildering complexity. During her first week, while meticulously changing a dressing for a gaunt, middle-aged man in a Luftwaffe uniform, he unexpectedly offered thanks in Yiddish. He had grown up in the Jewish quarter of Warsaw, he explained, before the war, before the uniform. The words hung in the air, a fleeting, almost surreal echo of a shared heritage in a place where such connections should have been utterly eradicated. This unexpected instance of gratitude, delivered in the language of her ancestors, served to complicate the moral landscape even further, hinting at individual stories hidden beneath the uniform, human layers beneath the enemy. This profound moral complexity, however, reached its zenith in the experience of Nurse Rachel Bernstein. At 24, Rachel's family history was particularly devastating. Her grandparents had vanished in Auschwitz, their fates sealed in the gas chambers, leaving her with an inherited trauma that resonated deeply. She had volunteered for the program, driven by a quiet, fierce desire to affirm humanity in the face of its absolute negation. One afternoon, while working in a crowded tent filled with freshly admitted casualties, she approached a young SS soldier, no older than 20. His injury was a severe abdominal shrapnel wound, bleeding profusely, and his face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat of pain and fear. Rachel, accompanied by her partner, Lieutenant Eleanor Vance, began the painstaking process of cleaning the wound and preparing it for suturing. Her movements were precise, her hands steady, her expression calm and professional, a mask against the turmoil within. The young German, his breath ragged, watched her, his blue eyes wide and unfocused with pain. As she carefully applied an antiseptic solution, the soldier's hand, trembling slightly, reached out and clutched her forearm. His grip was surprisingly weak yet urgent. He pulled her closer, his voice a hoarse whisper, thick with tears that streamed freely down his dirt-streaked cheeks. "Will my mother forgive me for what I did?" he choked out, the words raw and desperate, an unburdening of a soul in agony. The question hung in the stale, medical-scented air of the tent, a chilling echo that resonated with the depths of Rachel's own personal loss. Her grandparents, her relatives, all gone. And here, before her, was a man who, by his uniform, by his age, could have been complicit in the very system that had consumed her family. She felt something profound shatter within her, not the expected surge of hatred or rage, but something far more insidious, an existential nausea. It was the sickening realization of evil's tangible presence, not as an abstract concept, but within a tearful man. It was the terrifying recognition that the monster was not an alien other, but a man, just a man, whose actions had contributed to an unimaginable horror. Maintaining professional composure, Rachel gently disengaged his grip. Her face remained impassive, betraying no internal convulsion. She completed the delicate procedure in silence, her focus absolute, her breathing shallow. The suturing, the final dressing, all performed with unwavering precision. When the wound was secured, she nodded curtly to Eleanor, gathered her instruments, and moved away, her back ramrod straight. She exited the tent, walked behind a row of supply barracks, and vomited violently. The physical expulsion offered little relief from the moral sickness that had gripped her. Later, in her diary by lantern light, Rachel transcribed her profound moral disorientation. "I don't know what is worse, to hate them as monsters or to see them as men. Monsters are easy to destroy, men who do monstrous things. That breaks something fundamental about how we understand the world." Her entry captured the unsettling ordinariness of evil, a confrontation with its banality that began to unravel her understanding of the world. The initial weeks of the program had proven a crucible, forging a complex comprehension of humanity's capacity for both profound good and unimaginable depravity. As April turned to May 1945, the field hospitals, once scenes of immediate trauma, settled into a strained routine. For the Jewish nurses, daily interactions with wounded German soldiers revealed consistent patterns, some expected, others profoundly unsettling. These observations began to illuminate the collective psychological landscape of the defeated enemy. A predominant and disturbing pattern was the widespread, almost pathological denial of the Holocaust among most German soldiers. Regardless of their unit, Wehrmacht conscripts, older reservists, or lower-ranking SS members, a common narrative emerged when atrocities were indirectly referenced. "We only heard rumors," was a frequent refrain, often delivered with feigned bewilderment. "We never saw anything ourselves." This denial manifested not as outright belligerence but as a blank stare, a deliberate redirection, or a swift shift to their own suffering. Others invoked the defense of obedience. "We were just following orders," a phrase intended to absolve personal responsibility. Still others insisted they had fought for Germany, not for Nazism. This collective refusal to confront their complicity, even indirect in the industrial genocide, proved more disturbing for many nurses than overt hostility. The hatred of a fanatic was clear. The disavowal of truth by seemingly ordinary men blurred the lines between victim and perpetrator, creating a profound existential unease. To understand the psychological impact on the nurses, Captain Esther Levy, a 35-year-old military psychiatrist, began confidential interviews. Operating from a quiet, converted office, Levy meticulously documented their experiences. She identified a complex and contradictory pattern of emotional responses. The nurses reported simultaneous feelings: a professional compassion for the physical suffering of their patients, allowing them to perform duties effectively irrespective of ideology. Yet this was consistently intertwined with a profound moral repulsion for the patient's undeniable complicity. The uniforms, the occasional tattoos, the casual anti-Semitic remarks, or simply the knowledge of what these men represented, fueled a deep-seated revulsion. However, Levy also noted a third, unexpected emotional component: a potent sense of power. This power did not stem from dominance or retribution, but from the conscious act of demonstrating mercy and upholding ethical principles precisely when they could have justifiably withheld them. "They are proving their own humanity," Levy recorded, "by refusing to be dehumanized by the very people who sought to dehumanize them. It isn't an affirmation of moral strength, a victory of spirit in the face of immense provocation. This complex interplay of compassion, repulsion, and moral affirmation defined their daily psychological landscape." In stark counterpoint to this widespread denial, instances of unrepentant, fanatical hatred also emerged. Lieutenant Hannah Goldberg, a 27-year-old nurse, encountered one such case in a field hospital near Munich. Her patient was a high-ranking SS officer, gravely wounded in the abdomen. Despite his critical condition, his eyes burned with unwavering ideological commitment. Over several days, as Hannah meticulously cared for him, the officer used his remaining strength to scrawl crude, virulent anti-Semitic insults onto the wall beside his cot. One evening, as Hannah prepared to administer crucial antibiotics for a rapidly developing septicemia, she saw him defacing the wall again. Calmly, she asked, "Why do you waste your remaining strength on hatred?" The officer, his breath shallow, turned to her, his eyes blazing. "I would rather die hating Jews," he rasped, "than live owing my life to one." He then explicitly refused the antibiotics from her hands. Despite warnings, he remained unyielding. 3 days later, the SS officer succumbed to septicemia. Hannah Goldberg wrote in her official report, "I felt relief when he died. Not satisfaction, not joy, just the relief of not having to confront that level of pure hatred once more. Does this make me less professional, less human? I do not know anymore." Her words laid bare the profound personal cost of facing such unyielding, self-destructive malice. Yet, the true shock, the most psychologically lacerating experience, came when these nurses began comparing their treatment of German soldiers with the care they provided to the newly liberated concentration camp survivors. Lieutenant Sarah Weinberg, among the first at Dachau, found herself shuttling between a field hospital for German prisoners and an infirmary for camp survivors, both located just miles apart. The contrast was not merely stark, it was surreal, a grotesque juxtaposition that provided disturbing moral clarity. In the mornings, Sarah attended to German soldiers. Even with severe injuries, their bodies possessed a relative robustness, nourished until recently. Their organs, though damaged by war, had not been systematically starved. They often had the luxury of complaining about bland food or uncomfortable beds. Sarah vividly recalled an SS soldier, recovering from a minor shrapnel wound, irritably lamenting that his hospital gruel lacked sufficient salt. In the afternoons, Sarah shifted her focus to the skeletal figures in the survivor infirmary. Here, patients were specters, ravaged by years of starvation. Many weighed less than 88 pounds, their organs were failing, their wounds struggling to heal due to complete nutritional depletion. Sarah often spoon-fed watery gruel to a 14-year-old girl, weighing barely 65 pounds, whose body had forgotten how to process food. The girl would often stare blankly, barely registering the sustenance, her emaciated frame a testament to ultimate human degradation. Sarah Weinberg's personal reflections captured the harrowing absurdity. In the morning, I administer an IV drip to an SS soldier who complains the hospital food lacks salt. In the afternoon, I spoon-feed watery gruel to a 14-year-old girl weighing 65 pounds who can barely recognize she is being fed. The SS soldier will likely recover easily. The girl will probably die because her body has forgotten how to process food. This daily, direct confrontation with the vastly different physical realities of perpetrator and victim created an unshakable, agonizing moral clarity. It hammered home the absolute fragility of civilization and the ease with which ordinary men could be transformed into cogs in a genocidal machine. The enduring image of the relatively robust, complaining enemy soldier versus the dying ethereal child victim became etched into the consciousness of these nurses, a silent, powerful testament to the abyss they had walked through. As the spring of 1945 deepened, and the initial searing intensity of the encounters in the field hospitals gradually gave way to the enduring grind of medical care, the Jewish nurses who had volunteered for this extraordinary program began to process the profound implications of their experiences. The direct, often agonizing juxtaposition of treating both perpetrators and victims had etched an indelible clarity into their understanding of humanity and its deepest flaws. It was a clarity that transcended the immediate medical tasks, forcing them to confront fundamental questions about good and evil, identity and choice. Captain Ruth Goldstein, the Berlin-born nurse, whose diary had earlier articulated the motivation to prove her own humanity, later reflected on the broader revelations gleaned from months of this harrowing work. Her initial resolve, forged in defiance, evolved into a more complex, almost chilling understanding. "I came to prove that we were better than them," she wrote in her post-war annotations. "I learned something far more terrifying, that we are not essentially different. They were not monsters from another planet, some alien, inhuman species. They were men, ordinary men, who made horrible choices or allowed others to make them. This means that the difference between civilization and barbarity is not who we are inherently, but what we choose to do each day, each moment." This stark observation, derived from intimate proximity to both the suffering and the ideological emptiness of their German patients, dismantled simplistic notions of evil. It underscored the terrifying ease with which ordinary individuals could become agents of atrocity, revealing the inherent fragility of civil society itself. It was a realization that carried a weight beyond the battlefield, challenging the very foundations of how humanity perceived its own nature. The experiment, as Colonel Marcus had cautiously termed it, yielded results that were clinically precise, yet emotionally profound. Official data, compiled between April and August of 1945, provided a dispassionate accounting of an intensely human endeavor. Approximately 340 Jewish American and British nurses participated in the coordinated treatment of wounded German prisoners across Allied medical facilities in Germany and Austria. During this period, these nurses collectively attended to roughly 28 Fußeren wounded German soldiers. The meticulous records indicated a remarkable level of professional care. The overall mortality rate among these German prisoners under Allied care stood at approximately 3.2%. This figure, while still tragic, was notably lower than the 8.7% mortality rate recorded among Allied wounded soldiers during the same period, a statistic that reflected the Allied command's necessary prioritization of resources for its own combat troops, but also tacitly demonstrated the competent and ethical medical care provided to the enemy. Crucially, military investigations and medical reviews found no documented cases of intentional negligence or deliberate medical abuse perpetrated by the Jewish nurses, despite the omnipresent opportunities and the profound personal justification they might have felt for such acts. Their adherence to the Hippocratic Oath and to the rigorous protocols established by Colonel Marcus remained unwavering. However, the human cost of this moral crucible was not negligible. Of the 340 nurses involved, 47 formally requested and received transfers from their assignments before the designated completion of their duties. Their official grounds for transfer consistently cited psychological trauma or severe emotional distress, acknowledging the immense burden of caring for men intrinsically linked to their people's genocide. Yet a vast majority, 293 nurses, completed their assignments, with many voluntarily continuing their service beyond the original stipulated period. Their perseverance in the face of such extraordinary demands underscored a profound collective resolve. The legacy of this extraordinary experience, born from the dire necessities of war and the unwavering resolve of these nurses, echoed far beyond the provisional field hospitals of defeated Germany. Its impact was felt in the unfolding efforts to rebuild a semblance of international justice. When the Nuremberg trials commenced in November 1945, bringing the architects of the Third Reich to account for their crimes against humanity, the actions of these Jewish nurses provided a crucial, devastating moral contrast. Many defendants, in their attempts to mitigate their guilt, argued that their participation in the Holocaust was justified by the alleged subhuman nature of the Jewish people, a narrative of systematic dehumanization central to Nazi ideology. The testimony, both formal and informal, of Jewish nurses who had treated their German captors and soldiers with professionalism and compassion utterly undermined this defense. It served as irrefutable evidence that if the victims could maintain their humanity, their professionalism, and their ethical principles even while caring for their torturers, then no defense remained for the perpetrators who claimed their actions were merely against Untermensch, or subhumans. The sheer undeniable fact of Jewish women healing Nazi men stood as a silent, powerful indictment against the core tenets of their persecutors' twisted philosophy. In the decades that followed, many of these nurses, like countless other veterans, remained reluctant to publicly discuss their experiences. The moral weight of the memory, the complexity of the choices they had made, proved too intricate for simple words or easy public consumption. Some channeled their experiences into new forms of service, becoming vocal human rights activists, others pioneering psychologists specializing in trauma. Dr. Miriam Rosenfeld, who had meticulously documented her first week in the field hospitals, went on to become a distinguished figure in the field of psychological resilience studies. Reflecting on her wartime service in 1985, at the age of 68, her perspective was distilled by time and wisdom. "People often ask me if I regret treating those men," she stated in a recorded interview. "My answer is always the same. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the world allowed itself to reach a point where such a choice had to be made. But given that I stood before that choice, I do not regret choosing humanity over hatred. Because in the end," she concluded, her voice firm and clear, "the only real vengeance against those who tried to dehumanize us is to refuse to become like them." The lessons gleaned from these women's experiences continue to resonate as one of the most profound and disturbing legacies of the Second World War. They revealed that good and evil are not simple, fixed categories embodied in different groups of people, but rather dynamic choices made moment by moment, even in the most extreme and morally corrosive circumstances. These Jewish nurses proved, through their actions, that it is possible to maintain ethical principles and professional integrity even when confronted with their absolute antithesis. And perhaps most unsettlingly, their work unveiled that the perpetrators of atrocities are not alien monsters, but often ordinary human beings whose shared humanity makes their crimes not less, but far more disturbing. In that spring of 1945, within the makeshift medical tents of a defeated Germany, Jewish nurses faced the horror of genocide not with vengeance, but with something far more potent and enduring, with an unshakable affirmation that our humanity is not defined by what others do to us, but by what we choose to do in response. Their acts of healing, in the face of unprecedented hatred, became a lasting testament to the indomitable spirit of human compassion and moral courage. In the crucible of post-war Germany, amidst the ashes of the Third Reich and the unspeakable horrors revealed, a profound moral victory was meticulously documented. Jewish nurses, many bearing the silent scars of genocide, confronted their deepest human instincts, extending their hands not in retribution, but in healing. Their unwavering adherence to the Hippocratic Oath, even for those who had directly served the machinery of their people's destruction, crafted an enduring testament to the resilience of ethical principles, etched into the quiet efficiency of their temporary wards. The cold statistics, 340 nurses, 28, our soldiers treated, a 3.2% mortality rate, significantly lower than Allied casualties, and not a single documented case of intentional neglect, stand as a silent, powerful indictment against the very ideology of hatred. Their collective actions illuminated a chilling yet hopeful truth, that the demarcation between civilization and barbarity lies not in an inherent nature, but in the conscious, often agonizing, choices made each day. The monstrous, they revealed, often wears the face of the seemingly ordinary, making the conscious affirmation of compassion not a weakness, but the ultimate, most profound act of defiance against dehumanization. This narrative stands as a stark reminder of humanity's enduring capacity for both profound cruelty and extraordinary moral courage, defining our essence not by what is inflicted upon us, but by what we choose to offer in return. As Dr. Miriam Rosenfeld observed, the only true vengeance is to refuse to become like those who sought to destroy one's humanity. This extraordinary chapter in human history compels a difficult introspection. In the crucible of such profound personal trauma and collective outrage, what do you believe would have been the most just path? Share your considered reflections in the comments below. For more stories unearthed from the hidden corners of the past, narratives of courage and moral complexity during World War II, explore our other features on WW2 Lost Stories. If this journey through a forgotten corner of courage and conviction resonated with you, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribe to WW2 Lost Stories for more deep dives into the untold narratives that shaped our world.